My name is Warren Buffett, and before this whole situation gets turned into another loud headline or dramatic political moment, I want to set the record straight. Every time my name drifts into a political storm, people stop seeing me as a man who reads balance sheets and start treating me like a character in someone else's script. They put a headline over my face, wrap a red breaking news banner under it, and suddenly I'm framed as the man who took on Donald Trump. That has never been the way I operate. I've spent most of my life staying far from political theater. I talk about businesses, about numbers, about long-term thinking and the slow compounding of value. I don't look for fights, I don't enjoy public feuds, and I certainly don't wake up hoping to be part of a national shouting match. But sometimes money and politics collide so loudly that even a quiet man in Omaha gets pulled straight into the center of a story he never intended to join. That's exactly what happened here. The headline that began circulating was dramatic enough to make anyone pause. Buffett exposes the real donors behind Trump's campaign losses. And right behind that headline came the whisper that Trump was angry. People imagined I had marched onto a stage and dropped a binder full of secret names in front of cameras. That's not how life works in Nebraska. There are no rehearsed confrontations, no theatrical reveals. What I actually did was something much simpler and, in my world, far more dangerous. I told the truth about how money reacts when leadership turns policy into a performance. When economic decisions become unpredictable and policies turn into plot twists, the people who feel the first shock aren't the voters watching at home. It's the men and women writing the biggest checks. And at this moment in history, many of those checks were keeping Donald Trump's political machinery running. The story began on what looked like a peaceful Omaha morning. The sky was gentle, the phones were quiet, and I assumed I might get away with reading annual reports uninterrupted. Then my assistant stepped into the room with the expression that says the day has taken a sharp turn. She told me that my comments from the previous night were everywhere, and reporters wanted to know if I had just turned Trump's own donor network into his biggest liability. Even at my age, that type of sentence makes you sit up straighter. But I knew exactly what I had said and what I had not. I hadn't leaked any confidential information. I hadn't exposed private donor lists. The names of major contributors were already sitting in public filings. All I had done was answer a very basic question. What happens when a candidate's own decisions wipe billions off the fortunes of the people funding him? I answered the way I always answer financial questions, without drama, without hidden motives, and with a clear explanation of how markets behave. Markets don't pledge allegiance to political parties. They don't clap at rallies, and they don't respond to slogans. They respond to information, risk, and probability. So when tariffs appear overnight, when major policy announcements come without warning, when global economic signals look like cliffhangers from a television show rather than strategic planning, the market doesn't admire the showmanship, it braces for impact. And when a sector loses 8 or 10, or even 15% in a single trading day, that loss doesn't come from thin air. It comes out of portfolios and balance sheets. It comes out of the pockets of the major investors who happen to also be some of Trump's largest political backers. Once I explained this clearly, journalists did what they do best. They followed the money. They turned toward the filings, the disclosure reports, the public numbers everyone tends to overlook until someone points at them. They began identifying who, exactly, was taking the biggest financial damage during those volatile policy swings. And the names that surfaced weren't mysterious. Energy magnates, shipping and manufacturing leaders, real estate financiers, people whose businesses depend on stability, steady trade flow, and predictable regulatory environments. People who supported Trump not because they were fools, but because they believed he would tilt the system in their favor. But market turbulence doesn't play favorites. It simply responds, and when billions were erased in days, those donors felt the losses in real time. When the stories came out, the headlines were anything but subtle. They claimed I had exposed billionaire backers or revealed hidden financial fractures. None of that was true. I hadn't exposed anyone. All I exposed was the math behind the chain reaction. Unpredictable policy, market shock, donor wealth destroyed. That's not a conspiracy, it's arithmetic. But politics rarely accepts simple explanations when a dramatic one sells better. Suddenly, the narrative had a clean, repeatable structure. Trump makes a move, the market reacts violently, donors lose billions, Buffett explains why. And once a story fits neatly into a single sentence, it spreads faster than any correction or clarification ever can. Eventually, I heard that Trump himself was furious. Not because my assessment differed from his perspective. We've disagreed on economics before. What bothered him, I was told, was the idea that my calm explanation might shake the confidence of the people writing the largest checks. At the highest level of politics, you can survive bad press, tough interviews, or courtroom drama. What you cannot comfortably survive is a room full of billionaires thinking, "Is this man costing me more money than he can ever deliver?" Once that doubt enters their minds, everything changes. The situation becomes like a poker table in Las Vegas. A loud, confident player boasts he always beats the house. His friends stack chips in front of him, believing the bravado. For a while he wins. Then the cards shift. Slowly at first, then all at once, the stack starts shrinking, and the people backing him suddenly feel every single loss. They don't blame the cards. They blame the player. That is the danger. Not the headlines. Not the noise. The moment when the people funding the game start wondering whether they should walk away from the table. A week after the headlines started swirling, the mood in the financial world shifted from discomfort to something heavier, something that felt like the air before a storm. I began hearing from people I hadn't spoken to in years, old colleagues, portfolio managers, retired executives, people who rarely reached out unless something important was trembling beneath the surface. None of them mentioned the headlines directly, but every conversation circled the same point. The donors were no longer just upset. They were reassessing. And reassessment is the quiet cousin of retreat. Once big money starts asking second questions, the first answers are already losing power. In those same days, I was told about a fundraising conference call that went sideways. The call was supposed to energize major backers, reassure them, remind them of the bigger mission. But instead of enthusiasm, the donors delivered something else. Data. Hard numbers, spreadsheets full of red, charts showing the very sectors they relied on, taking hit after hit. One donor allegedly asked, "Why are we paying for stability and getting volatility?" That question landed like a stone, dropped in a still lake, sending ripples through everyone on the line. You could almost feel the frost forming, because that question isn't a political question. It's a financial one, and financial questions have no loyalty. They have only math. Meanwhile, advisors within Trump's circle were scrambling. They weren't worried about the public polls. They were worried about the money polls. In modern campaigns, money polls matter more. Money doesn't just fund ads. It funds movement, strategy, outreach, travel, legal buffers, digital warfare, infrastructure. When money slows, the machinery around a candidate slows. And when the machinery slows, perception shifts. Perception becomes doubt. Doubt becomes weakness. Weakness becomes a story. And that story begins to write itself whether you like it or not. What I learned from someone close to one major donor was even more telling. At a closed-door industry meeting, a prominent energy executive pulled up a slide showing how much his company had lost during each of Trump's unpredictable policy swings. When he finished presenting, he didn't yell, he didn't complain, he didn't blame anyone personally. He simply said, "We can survive bad policies. What we can't survive is policies that change every 72 hours. The room fell silent. Executives don't fear losses, they fear patterns. And they were beginning to see a pattern they could no longer ignore. At the same time, journalists kept building the narrative on the outside. They weren't quoting me anymore. They didn't need to. The market was doing the talking. But because my earlier explanation had provided a neat framework, every new article used that same frame. Trump's donors rattled as volatility rises. Financial allies brace for further shocks. Quiet tension among billionaire backers. It didn't matter whether I spoke again or not. The narrative had detached from me and taken on a life of its own. Trump, I was told, couldn't stand that. Not because of me personally, I'm just an old investor in Omaha, but because the two words he hates most in any headliner, losing confidence, those Words can fracture the foundation of any political empire. And in this case, the fractures were spreading under the surface like cracks in winter ice. More calls came in from wealth managers who were trying to read the temperature of their clients. They weren't panicking. They were calculating. Calculating if their clients should reduce exposure. Calculating whether to scale back donations. Calculating whether they needed to hedge politically the same way they hedge financially. One manager told me, "My clients feel like they backed a pilot who won't stop shaking the controls just to watch the turbulence." That wasn't meant as an insult. It was an assessment. And assessments from wealthy donors are far more dangerous to a campaign than attacks from media critics. Media doesn't decide the budget. Donors do. Then, the moment that truly defined the shift happened quietly. No microphones, no cameras, no press leaks, just a private dinner at a home in Dallas. Several influential donors attended, mostly from energy and real estate industries. Usually, these gatherings were filled with laughter, confidence, and predictions about future influence. But that night was different. A friend who attended told me that the first half of the dinner felt like everyone was pretending. Smiling politely, making small talk. But the second half? That's when things cracked. Someone mentioned that his company had lost nearly $1 billion in valuation after a surprise tariff announcement. Another mentioned his shipping portfolio took a beating after one of Trump's late-night statements about foreign policy. Slowly, the conversation shifted from politics to losses, from excitement to caution, from support to calculation. And then someone said it plainly. "We didn't sign up to be collateral damage." That line echoed through the table. You could almost hear chairs shift, glasses being set down, the weight of reality settling across the room. And then, unexpectedly, they brought up me. Not my politics, not my opinions, not my interviews. They brought up the logic I had explained. Someone reportedly said, "Buffett might not like Trump, but the numbers he gave are exactly what we're living through." In that moment, I became something dangerous. Not a critic, not a commentator, but a mirror. A mirror reflecting back the truth they already knew, but didn't want to say out loud. That more than anything is what Trump hates. Not disagreement, not criticism, but the idea that someone else's explanation might resonate more deeply with his most powerful supporters than his own narrative. Because once a donor believes your explanation more than the candidate's reassurance, the bond between money and politics begins to loosen. That's why the silence in donor circles grew even heavier. In silence is the secret language of powerful people. They don't scream. They don't storm out. They go quiet. They cancel meetings politely. They postpone commitments. They ask for more data. They say they want time to evaluate. That's how retreat begins in high finance, not with a crash, but with a whisper. And those whispers were spreading. You could feel them behind closed doors. You could feel them in the markets. You could feel them in the fundraising numbers. You could even feel them in the tone of Trump's own public comments, an edge, a defensiveness, a flicker of awareness that something outside the camera frame was shifting beneath his feet. By the time the second week came around, everyone was watching the same thing, even if they didn't admit it. Not the speeches, not the rallies, not the interviews, but the donors. Because once the donor class begins to hesitate, a campaign doesn't collapse immediately. But it starts leaning ever so slightly, like a skyscraper whose foundation has begun to drift. It still stands tall. It still looks strong, but those who understand structures know exactly what that tilt means. And that is where the story was truly headed, not toward a headline, but toward the quiet rooms where power is measured not in votes or applause, but in confidence. And confidence, once shaken, doesn't return easily. They weren't asking, "Is this bad luck anymore?" They were asking something far more dangerous. Is this the beginning of a trend? That shift, from accident to pattern, was the quiet earthquake under everything. Because once donors start believing they are looking at a pattern, everything changes. Patterns imply continuation. Patterns imply repetition. Patterns imply that the thing you're seeing today might be the same thing you'll see tomorrow, next quarter, and next election cycle. And no billionaire wants to be caught on the wrong side of a pattern he didn't prepare for. That's the moment when hesitation becomes strategy. and strategy becomes self-preservation. Behind closed doors, campaign advisors began describing the donor mood as soft, which is political shorthand for they're getting ready to walk. In those circles, nobody says it directly. They speak in coded language. Words like stability, trajectory, sustainability, exposure. Every one of them is a quiet alarm bell. And the worst part was this. Every donor heard the same alarms at the same time. That synchronized anxiety created a kind of gravitational pull that even Trump's most loyal allies couldn't counter. They tried, of course. They held more briefings, sent more memos, released more statements insisting everything was fine. But donors weren't listening to words anymore. They were watching numbers. And numbers don't lie to make people feel better. In private rooms in New York, Houston, Los Angeles, Palm Beach, something else began happening. Something campaigns fear the most. Donors began asking each other for second opinions. When one billionaire quietly consults another billionaire about political exposure, it signals uncertainty. But when groups of billionaires begin comparing notes, the narrative shifts from personal uncertainty to collective doubt. And collective doubt is the death spiral of any political movement that relies on money. One investor at a private luncheon reportedly asked, "What's our upside if the volatility continues?" Another replied, "There is no upside. There's survival." When conversations shift from profit to survival, the confidence floor collapses under the whole system. These weren't people who panicked easily. They weren't fragile. They weren't emotional. They were some of the most calculating minds in global finance. But even they were beginning to question the one thing they rarely question, their own judgment. That's when the whispers started spreading about repositioning, not withdrawing, repositioning. It's a softer word, but in the donor world, it means the same thing. It means redirecting money, diversifying influence, strengthening relationships in other political corners. And nothing terrifies a campaign more than hearing donors use words like reposition, diversify, evaluate. Because those words aren't about today, they're about tomorrow. First came the meetings, then came the delays, then came the emails that said, "Let's reassess next quarter. Let's wait until after the next announcement. Let's monitor conditions." Every one of those messages was a slow turning away from the commitment they had once made without hesitation. And Trump's team felt it. They felt it in the tone of conversations. They felt it in the reduced enthusiasm. They felt it in the sudden politeness of donors who were once bold, loud, and certain. Someone close to the campaign confessed privately, "It's like the energy shifted overnight." They're still here, but only halfway. Halfway support is worse than open criticism. Open criticism can be countered. Halfway support? That's the slow, silent draining of momentum. It's like watching a balloon deflate without a sound. Trump reportedly grew more frustrated, not because donors were leaving, but because they were hesitating. He understands conflict. He can respond to attacks. But hesitation is intangible. You can't punch it. You can't outrun it. You can't intimidate it. It just sits there, quietly eroding confidence in every room it touches. Inside strategy meetings, advisors began analyzing every donor behavior down to the smallest detail. Shorter calls, delayed replies, fewer enthusiastic quotes for the press. One aide described it as trying to map shadows. They were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't name, couldn't confront publicly. The enemy wasn't a person. It was a feeling. It was doubt. And doubt had begun spreading faster than any memo could stop. Then came a moment that shook the entire fundraising apparatus. A major donor, one whose name had weight in every boardroom, requested a full economic risk assessment before finalizing his next contribution. That kind of request was unheard of in that world. Contributions are emotional, ideological, relational. They're not tied to spreadsheets. But this donor wanted a financial breakdown of how political volatility might affect his larger empire. That was the moment it became official. Politics had become a liability. More donors soon followed. Some requested updated polling. Some demanded clearer policy outlines. Some insisted on private assurances that the turbulence would settle. And Trump's advisors struggled to provide those assurances because they weren't sure themselves. Meanwhile, Independent analysts kept releasing more data. Every report cut deeper than the last. One showed how small policy fluctuations had triggered disproportionate market reactions. Another demonstrated that industries tied closely to the candidates' statements were now the most unstable sectors in the entire index. These weren't activist think tanks. These were conservative economic groups with reputations built on caution. That made their conclusions even more devastating. Behind the scenes, an executive from a global investment firm reportedly said, "This is the first time I've seen the donors scared of their own candidates' unpredictability." Another responded, "It's not the man, it's the uncertainty. Markets don't price uncertainty well." That statement spread like wildfire. Investors quoted it. Advisors repeated it. Donors whispered it. Trump's team tried to counter with confidence, with speeches, with promises of stability. But stability isn't something you can declare. It's something investors must feel. And they didn't feel it anymore. That's when the quiet shift became an open pattern. Donors weren't just hesitating now. They were recalculating, remeasuring, reevaluating the long-term cost of staying aligned. This was no longer about politics. This was about portfolios, reputations, and generational wealth. And in that world, once doubt enters the bloodstream, it never leaves quietly. What happened next was not a dramatic explosion, not a headline, not a televised confrontation. It was quieter, slower, more corrosive. Campaigns rarely fall apart because of something loud. They fall apart because of the weight of 1,000 small hesitations. And that was exactly what began to unfold in the aftermath of that Palm Beach meeting. The donors went home, each carrying the same uneasy realization, each rehearsing the same internal calculation. Not one of them said publicly that they were reconsidering their commitments. Not one withdrew $1 in a way anyone could see. But their confidence had shifted. It tilted, just slightly. But when enough large forces tilt at once, equilibrium changes. Inside Trump's world, the first sign was subtle. A planned high-dollar fundraiser expected to fill within hours took 2 days, then 3. Staffers blamed timing, scheduling conflicts, donor fatigue. Anything but the truth. But the truth was unavoidable. The fundraising engine wasn't firing the way it used to, and people who had once taken pride in writing massive checks began sending their assistants instead of attending the events personally. The absence of a donor is louder than their presence ever is. When a billionaire stays home, the message is unmistakable. I'm re-evaluating. No words are needed. A longtime fundraiser told me something I never forgot. He said, "When donors start sending proxies, they've already left the room emotionally." And in politics, emotional departure often precedes financial departure. The campaign sensed it, but didn't know how to stop it. They responded with the only tool they trusted, volume. More speeches, more promises, more pressure on donors to come through big. But pressure is a funny thing. It either strengthens commitment or reveals weakness. The donors, already nervous, now felt cornered. One of Trump's senior advisors reportedly warned him that pushing too hard would backfire. But Trump didn't believe in subtlety. He believed loyalty should be demonstrated, not negotiated. So he doubled down. He demanded bigger commitments, faster timelines, louder endorsements. The donors, though, were not responding to demands. They were responding to numbers. Their losses were mounting. Their analysts were sounding alarms. Their boards were questioning exposure. And their reputations, perhaps the most valuable asset any billionaire has, felt increasingly tied to instability. That's when the internal fissures began to show. Advisors within the campaign started blaming one another. The finance team accused the communications team of failing to control the media narrative. The communications team blamed policy advisors for unpredictable announcements. The strategists blamed the data team for sending flawed projections. And everyone blamed the donors for being skittish. But donors weren't skittish. They were calculating. Calculation is not fear. It's discipline. And disciplined people do not throw good money after bad signals. During this time, another confidential set of financial reports circulated through major investment groups. These weren't memos. They were internal briefings from risk teams mapping out which political environments produced the sharpest market reactions. The conclusions were sobering. Every time a policy was announced in a certain direction, markets reacted negatively. Not mildly, but sharply, sometimes within minutes. These charts made the rounds in private boardrooms, emailed only to executives, shown briefly on tablets, discussed in low voices. Each time one of those reports surfaced, donors tightened another valve of caution. And while the donors drifted, the campaign pushed harder. They began calling donors multiple times a week, sometimes daily, asking for reassurance, updates, commitments, anything. The donors hated it. Wealthy people accept many inconveniences, but desperation is not one of them. They respond to strength, to certainty, to stability. They do not respond well to panic, even subtle panic masked as enthusiasm. Around this time, I received yet another message from a financial advisor who worked with a major industrial magnate. He said, "Warren, my client told me something today that worried me." He said, "I'm starting to feel like the campaign needs me more than I need them." That's a bad place for any campaign to be in. He was right. When donors start believing they hold the leverage, they stop being participants and start being judges. Judges don't fund the show. They evaluate it. The investors began doing something even more telling. They shifted the way they talked about the campaign. Before, they'd say things like, "our guy," or "our candidate." Now they use distant phrases like "the situation" or "the environment." That change in language is not superficial. It marks psychological distance. And psychological distance is the first step toward disentanglement. Then came the next tremor. A major donor, who had always been a reliable pillar, quietly instructed his accountants to pause all political disbursements until further notice. The accountants didn't question why. They rarely do. They simply executed the order. But the news reached the campaign within hours. When money stops flowing unexpectedly, someone always notices. And someone always talks. Inside the campaign, the reaction was immediate. They scrambled to contact the donor, to clarify, to reassure, to salvage. But the donor didn't return the calls. Not for a day. Not for two. Not for a week. Silence again. And like before, silence was not neutrality. Silence was a signal. A bright, unmistakable signal that confidence was no longer assumed. Meanwhile, donors began comparing notes with each other quietly. Whispered conversations at golf clubs, hushed sidebar discussions at corporate retreats, coded language in private emails. They were not coordinating. They were converging, independently arriving at the same conclusion. The environment had grown too volatile to ignore, too unstable to dismiss, too uncertain to justify further risk without hesitation. At this point, Trump's team recognized that they were no longer fighting the media narrative or political opponents. They were fighting economic gravity. And nothing falls faster than confidence once it begins its descent. One insider described the atmosphere as a controlled slide, the kind where everyone insists everything is fine, even as they feel the ground shifting. Under their feet, the final blow didn't come from a donor, speech, or a public statement. It came from a number. A simple number on a spreadsheet that tracked weekly fundraising commitment projections. For months, the line had been steady, predictable, reliable. And then, in 1 week, it dipped sharply, not catastrophically, but unmistakably. Enough to trigger alarms. Enough to confirm what everyone feared. Enough to show the drift had become measurable. And that was the moment, the exact moment, the campaign realized they weren't dealing with concern anymore. They were dealing with instability. Real instability, the kind that doesn't announce itself with noise but with absence. With the quiet disappearance of certainty. With the subtle retreat of once boundless confidence. With the unmistakable truth that the people holding the purse strings were no longer invested in faith alone. When billionaire support becomes conditional, a campaign stops being a machine and becomes a question mark. And the question everyone was asking, quietly, privately, reluctantly, was this: how long can a campaign survive when its strongest foundation is beginning to erode from the inside? That was the moment everything truly changed.